They arrested the old man for impersonating a SEAL, until the Vice Admiral saw his unit tattoo. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The sunlight poured into the military base's mess hall, casting long shadows over the tables filled with young soldiers and officers. The clinking of cutlery and chatter filled the room, but it all seemed to fade into the background as an old man wheeled himself into the room. His name was Martin Kelly, and at 87 years old, he was no stranger to the quiet life after his years of service. His gnarled hands gripped the wheels of his chair as he made his way to an empty seat at the far end of the mess hall. His jacket was plain, his attire nothing special, just an old man in a faded uniform, with nothing to distinguish him from the many others who passed through the base. But as he settled into his seat, a group of younger Marines began to take notice. They exchanged glances, a mix of confusion and mockery flashing across their faces. One of them, a cocky young officer named Corporal Davis, sauntered over with a smirk. "Hey, old man, lost your way to the bingo hall?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. The laughter of his comrades followed, but Martin didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He simply took a sip from his coffee, the steam rising in front of his face. "I'm here for the breakfast," he muttered calmly. But that wasn't enough for Corporal Davis. He leaned in, crossing his arms, a grin still playing on his face. "Yeah? You're looking a little out of place, Grandpa. You in the right place." The other Marines snickered, enjoying the spectacle. Martin, though, remained silent. He wasn't bothered by their words. He had heard worse in his time. But then Davis, sensing an opportunity, pointed at the old man's collar, where a worn, faded insignia was pinned. "What's this?" he sneered. "Some kind of trophy from your retirement home." He tugged at the pin, his fingers pulling it up with a flick of his wrist. "Maybe you should be more careful with your costume. You're not fooling anyone here." The laughter grew louder, but Martin's expression remained unchanged. He didn't care for the mockery. What mattered was the quiet respect he had earned over decades of service. But as Davis continued to laugh and make jabs at the old man, something stirred in Martin. His eyes darkened for a brief moment, and he slowly placed his hand over the pin. "That pin," Martin said in a low, steady voice, "means more than you'll ever understand." But Davis wasn't listening. He grinned wider and gestured to the group. "Hey, somebody call the MPs. We got a faker here." The word stung, but Martin didn't react. Instead, he closed his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, the room around him seemed to fade. He was no longer in the mess hall. Instead, the sound of gunfire and helicopters filled his ears. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and sweat. The memory flooded back, a young Martin Kelly, serving as a SEAL in a distant jungle. It was 1968, and his unit had been pinned down during a covert mission. They were stranded, outnumbered, and surrounded by enemy forces. In that moment, Martin had made a promise to himself and to his brothers in arms. No matter the odds, he would never leave anyone behind. The image vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The room around him snapped back into focus. He looked at Davis, who still stood there, mocking him. And then, for the first time, Martin spoke clearly. "I'm not here for you. I'm here because I belong here." Before Davis could respond, a voice from across the room broke the tension. "Corporal Davis," said a calm, authoritative voice. It was the base commander, walking toward them with a look of quiet concern. Behind him, a Vice Admiral strode into the room, his expression unreadable. "What's going on here?" the commander asked, eyeing the young Marines. The Vice Admiral's gaze shifted to Martin, who still sat quietly in his chair, his hands resting on the wheels. A flicker of recognition passed over the Admiral's face, and without saying another word, he stepped forward, his eyes focused on the pin. Martin wore. The room fell silent, all eyes now on the Admiral as he knelt down in front of Martin. Slowly, deliberately, the Vice Admiral removed his own jacket sleeve to reveal a matching pin, identical to the one Martin had worn for years. "This man," the Admiral's voice rang out, steady and commanding, "is no imposter. He is Sergeant Major Martin Kelly, a living legend." and he deserves the respect of everyone in this room. The laughter died instantly, replaced by stunned silence. The young Marines, now realizing the gravity of the situation, stood frozen, unable to speak. Davis, who had mocked Martin so ruthlessly just moments before, could only stare at the Vice Admiral in shock. Martin, however, simply nodded, the weight of his past now acknowledged. The Admiral raised his hand in a salute, and the entire room followed suit, their respect now hard-earned and undeniable. The Vice Admiral's voice echoed across the room, his words carrying an undeniable weight. This man is no imposter. He is Sergeant Major Martin Kelly, a living legend, and he deserves the respect of everyone in this room. The words hit like a thunderclap, and the mess hall, which had been filled with laughter and mockery just moments ago, fell into a suffocating silence. The young Marines, who had been so quick to judge the old man, stood frozen in place, unable to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. Davis, still in disbelief, stared at the Admiral, his face drained of color, his arrogance vanished in an instant. Martin Kelly remained calm, his expression unchanged, as if he had been expecting this moment all along. The Vice Admiral turned back to Martin, his face softening with a rare and profound respect. "Sergeant Major Kelly," he said, his voice steady. "It's an honor to finally meet you." The old man simply nodded, his tired eyes meeting the Admiral's. He didn't need to say anything. The weight of his past spoke volumes. As the silence lingered in the room, the young Marines slowly began to process the gravity of the situation. They had just mocked a man whose name was synonymous with heroism, whose very presence commanded respect. And now, they were facing the consequences of their actions. The room was filled with tension as the Vice Admiral took a step back and motioned for the others to follow suit. "Raise your hand and salute," he commanded. One by one, the young soldiers raised their hands, the sharp click of their boots on the floor the only sound breaking the silence. Even Davis, still reeling from the shock, was compelled to follow the order. But Martin Kelly didn't need any of their salutes. He had earned his respect long ago. The Admiral turned to the others, his gaze stern yet understanding. This man was part of a team that gave everything. He led missions that saved countless lives. His contributions are etched into the history of this country, and his name is one of the most respected in the military. His words hung in the air, a solemn reminder of the weight that Martin carried with him. The young Marines stood at attention, some of them beginning to feel the sting of embarrassment creeping into their chests. But it wasn't just the act of mockery that had stung. It was the realization that they had disrespected someone who had lived through experiences they could never fathom. A new understanding began to settle in. Martin had never been one to demand respect. He had earned it through decades of selfless service. His quiet dignity, his unspoken strength, was a stark contrast to the brash, youthful arrogance they had displayed just moments ago. The Vice Admiral's eyes scanned the room, and for the first time since he had entered, his expression softened. "Sergeant Major Kelly, would you mind telling these men a little about your service?" he asked. Martin looked up, meeting the eyes of the young Marines one by one. He could see the guilt in their expressions, the dawning recognition of their mistake. "I'm not here to tell stories," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years spent in silence. "I'm here because it's my duty. It's my honor. And I'm here because I made a promise." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "I promised the men I served with that I would never leave them behind. And I've kept that promise every day of my life." His words hung in the air, a powerful reminder of the unspoken bond between soldiers, a bond that transcended rank, time, and distance. Martin's gaze softened, his eyes reflecting the memories of those who had fallen beside him. He wasn't here for recognition. He wasn't here for praise. He was here because he had done what needed to be done, without fanfare, without expectation. The room remained quiet, each Marine processing what they had just witnessed. The Admiral, seeing the shift in the atmosphere, nodded with approval. "That's what real honor looks like," he said, his voice low but filled with reverence. "And that's the kind of man you should aspire to be, not just in service, but in life." The Vice Admiral turned to Martin once more, his voice tinged with respect. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant Major. It's an honor to have you here with us today." Martin smiled faintly, his tired eyes glimmering with the faintest hint of pride. He nodded once, acknowledging the Admiral's words, before slowly standing up from his chair. He didn't need their applause. He didn't need their recognition. His journey had never been about that. It had always been about duty. As he wheeled himself out of the room, the young Marines stood silently, their eyes following him with a newfound respect. They had witnessed something today, something that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They had seen a true hero, not in the form of someone who demanded attention, but in the form of a quiet man who had earned his place in history without ever needing to prove it to anyone. The silence in the room was thick, almost suffocating. The young Marines stood at attention, their bodies rigid, as the weight of the moment sank in. They had just witnessed something profound, something that none of them could have anticipated. Martin Kelly, the old man they had mocked and dismissed just hours earlier, was no ordinary veteran. He was a living legend, and his quiet dignity had forced them to confront their own ignorance and arrogance. The Vice Admiral remained standing at the front, his posture impeccable, his expression one of quiet respect. He had seen the shift in the room, the respect that had grown out of the initial mockery, and he knew that this moment would stay with these men for a long time. "Sergeant Major Kelly," the Admiral said, breaking the silence, his voice low but filled with authority. "You have done more for this country than most of us can ever imagine. Your service is a testament to the values we all strive for. I want you to know that on behalf of this entire base, you have our deepest respect." Martin nodded again, his eyes steady, the weight of his years reflected in his gaze. He had never sought recognition, never expected anything but the quiet gratitude of those he had served with. But now, standing in front of these young Marines, he could feel the shift in their perception. They no longer saw him as just an old man in a wheelchair. They saw him for what he truly was, a hero. "Thank you, Admiral," Martin replied, his voice calm but carrying the weight of 1,000 battles fought and won. "But I am not here for recognition. I am here because I believe in what we stood for, and I believe in the importance of teaching the next generation." The Admiral's eyes softened, a small but appreciative smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You are right, Sergeant Major," he said. "Your wisdom is invaluable, and it is something that we cannot afford to lose." The room remained silent, each Marine processing the words they had just heard. They had come into this mess hall that morning, full of their own bravado and youthful energy, ready to mock and dismiss an elderly man. But now, they were faced with the reality that they had underestimated him. They had underestimated a man who had seen and done things that none of them could ever imagine. "Sergeant Major," the Admiral continued, his voice commanding but respectful, "I would like to invite you to speak to the men here, to share some of the lessons you have learned over the years. We could all benefit from your experience." Martin paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. The young Marines stood in front of him, their faces a mix of awe and apprehension. It was clear that they were ready to listen, ready to learn. Martin took a deep breath and wheeled himself to the front of the room. "I have lived through things," he began, his voice steady. "Things that have changed me, things that have shaped me into the man I am today. But I am not special. I am just one of many who have served this country. The only difference is that I had a job to do, and I did it to the best of my ability." The room hung on his every word, the young Marines listening intently, hanging on to the lessons that Martin had to offer. "We were all trained for battle," Martin continued. "But the true test comes after the battle is over. When you return home, when you face the world that you left behind. That is where the real work begins. It is easy to fight when you have a clear enemy. But the hardest fight is the one you fight inside yourself, the fight to keep your honor, your integrity, your humanity intact." The room was still, the only sound the quiet rustling of uniforms as the Marines shifted in place. Martin's words cut through the tension, reaching places that none of them had expected. "I've seen the horrors of war," Martin continued, "but I've also seen the beauty of human resilience. I've seen men who were broken, who thought they had nothing left to give, rise again and become heroes. That's what I want you to remember. It's not about the medals or the recognition. It's about the men you become, the choices you make when no one is watching. That is the true measure of a soldier." The young Marines stood in awe, their faces a mixture of respect and newfound understanding. They had come to this base thinking they had all the answers, but now, they realized that they had only just begun to learn. The Vice Admiral stepped forward, his expression one of approval. "Sergeant Major Kelly," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "Your words are a beacon for all of us. Thank you for sharing them. You've reminded us of what it truly means to serve, and what it takes to be a true leader." Martin nodded, his gaze steady. "It's my honor, Admiral. Just remember, it's not enough to serve. You have to serve with purpose, with integrity. And you have to remember that the true battle is the one that takes place after the war ends." The Vice Admiral turned to the young Marines, his voice filled with authority. "You've just witnessed something extraordinary. Take these lessons to heart. And remember, the man standing before you is not just a legend. He is a symbol of everything we strive to be. Show him the respect he deserves." As the young Marines stood at attention, their faces now filled with a newfound respect, Martin Kelly wheeled himself to the side, content in the knowledge that his words had made a difference. He had lived through so much, but it was moments like this that reminded him why he had served. Not for recognition, not for medals, but for the chance to pass on the lessons he had learned, to ensure that the next generation would understand what it truly meant to be a soldier. The room had fallen into a deep silence, the weight of Martin Kelly's words still hanging in the air. His quiet wisdom had touched the young Marines in a way none of them had expected. They had come to this base thinking they were the ones who had all the answers, but now, as they stood there in awe, they realized just how much they still had to learn. The Vice Admiral's words had carried a heavy respect, but Martin's words had struck a deeper chord, one that resonated beyond the military ranks and into the very core of their being. As the Marines began to process what had just happened, the Admiral motioned for them to follow him. "Sergeant Major Kelly," he said, his voice still carrying that same level of respect, "I think it's time we take a moment to properly honor your service." Martin, however, simply shook his head, his tired eyes softening with a quiet smile. "I don't need ceremony," he said. "What I need is for you all to take the lessons I've shared and carry them forward. That is the true honor, the one that will matter long after the medals and the accolades are forgotten." The Admiral looked at Martin, his admiration growing. "You're right, Sergeant Major. It's about the men we become, not the medals we wear." The young Marines stood at attention, their eyes fixed on Martin, not just as a legend, but as a living embodiment of what it meant to be a soldier. They had learned a valuable lesson that day, one that could not be taught in any classroom or through any drill. It was a lesson of humility, integrity, and the true meaning of service. As the group began to disperse, a few of the younger soldiers lingered behind. One of them, a lance corporal named Evans, approached Martin with a hesitant expression. "Sergeant Major," he began, his voice unsure, "I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't understand before what it really means to serve. You've taught me more in a few minutes than I've learned in my whole career." Martin smiled faintly, his eyes softening as he placed a hand on the young Marine's shoulder. "You'll get there, son," he said quietly. "You just need to keep your focus on the right things. It's not about the rank, the title, or the glory. It's about the work you do, the people you help, and the promises you keep." Evans nodded, his eyes filled with a new understanding. "I will, Sergeant Major." "Thank you." Martin nodded in return, then turned to leave the room, his wheelchair rolling smoothly across the floor. As he made his way toward the exit, the room was filled with a new sense of respect. The young Marines, once so full of bravado, now stood quietly, reflecting on the lessons they had just learned. They had seen Martin Kelly, the man they had once dismissed, in a new light. They had seen a hero, not because of his medals, but because of his actions and his unwavering commitment to the values that mattered most. As Martin reached the door, the Vice Admiral called out to him once more. "Sergeant Major Kelly, if you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask. You've earned more than enough respect here." Martin paused for a moment, his hand on the doorframe. He turned to look back at the Admiral, his gaze steady. "I've earned my respect through the things I've done, not through what I asked for," he said simply. "But thank you." With that, he wheeled himself out the door, leaving behind a group of Marines who had just witnessed the true meaning of honor and integrity. They had learned something that day that could never be taken away from them. They had learned that the measure of a man is not in his rank or his reputation, but in the way he lives his life, the way he treats others, and the way he holds to his principles, no matter the cost. The following days after the incident in the mess hall were quiet, but the atmosphere on base had changed. The young Marines who had once snickered behind Martin Kelly's back now watched him with a newfound respect. They no longer saw him as just an old man in a wheelchair. They saw him for what he truly was, a hero who had lived through more than they could imagine, a man who had earned every ounce of his respect through years of silent service. Evans, the young lance corporal who had spoken to Martin after the vice admiral's intervention, found himself reflecting on his own behavior. He hadn't realized it before, but the brashness he had once worn so proudly now felt hollow. He began to question everything, from the way he had looked down on veterans like Martin, to the way he had been quick to dismiss people based on appearances. It wasn't just Martin's military achievements that had struck him, but the humility with which he carried himself, despite everything he had been through. It was something Evans realized he lacked. Every time he saw Martin on base from that day forward, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his own shortcomings. The old man's quiet presence was a constant reminder of what it truly meant to be a soldier, not the bravado and posturing, but the quiet dignity and service that came with living up to a promise. Martin, on the other hand, didn't seem to mind the change in the air. He continued to go about his business, visiting the base's veterans clinic, talking to those who needed a listening ear, and occasionally stopping by the mess hall for a cup of coffee. His presence was a constant reminder to those around him that true greatness didn't need to be loudly proclaimed. It was simply lived. The day finally came when Martin received an unexpected invitation. It came from the base's commanding officer, Colonel Hayes, who had watched the entire ordeal unfold in the mess hall. The invitation was simple, but it carried a weight that Martin understood instantly. It was for him to attend a ceremony at the base, an event to honor his service. At first, Martin hesitated. He had never been one to seek out the spotlight, and he certainly didn't want any special treatment. But after some thought, he realized that perhaps it was time to accept the recognition, not for himself, but for the men and women who had served alongside him, the ones who never made it home. As Martin wheeled himself into the ceremony hall, he was greeted by a small but respectful crowd. The young Marines who had once mocked him now stood at attention, their faces sober and full of respect. Colonel Hayes was there as well, his face filled with a quiet pride. "Sergeant Major Kelly," he said, stepping forward. "Today, we honor you not just for your service, but for the lessons you have taught us all. You have shown us what it means to serve with honor, humility, and integrity." The ceremony was short, but it was powerful. Martin received a standing ovation from the gathered officers and soldiers, but his expression remained the same as it always had, calm, composed, and humble. He wasn't looking for applause. He had never been. He simply nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes scanning the room, briefly landing on the young Marines who had once laughed at him. They were the ones who now stood with heads held high, no longer with arrogance, but with true respect. As the ceremony came to a close, Colonel Hayes made a final announcement. "Sergeant Major Kelly has agreed to speak with all of us today, to share some of his wisdom, to remind us of what it means to truly serve. We are privileged to have him here with us." Martin slowly made his way to the front of the room, his wheelchair moving with a quiet grace. The room fell silent as he took his place at the podium. "I didn't come here to tell you stories of battle or bravery," Martin began, his voice steady. "I came here to remind you of something simple, something that gets lost in the rush of daily life." He paused, looking out at the young faces before him, the ones who had mocked him, the ones who now listened intently. "It's not about the rank you hold, the medals you wear, or the accolades you receive. It's about what you do when no one is looking. It's about the promises you make and keep, the lives you touch, the integrity you hold in the face of adversity." His words hung in the air, a quiet yet powerful call to action. True honor isn't something you seek. It's something you earn, day by day, through your actions and your choices. And that is what makes a man, not his title, not his past, but the person he is every single day. Martin paused again, his eyes scanning the room, meeting the eyes of the young Marines who had once looked down on him. They now stood tall, no longer the brash young men they had been, but soldiers who had seen the value in what Martin had shared. "Remember this," Martin continued, his voice growing softer. "When the uniform comes off, when the medals are put away, it's still you. And you'll be remembered not for your rank or your service, but for the way you treated others and the choices you made." As he finished speaking, the room fell into an even deeper silence. The young Marines were no longer just soldiers. They were learners, ready to carry the weight of their newfound understanding into their own lives. Martin Kelly, the old man in the wheelchair, had done more than earn their respect. He had changed them. He had shown them the true meaning of service. And in that quiet, unassuming way of his, he had left a legacy far greater than any medal could ever represent. The days following the ceremony passed quietly, but the atmosphere on the base was palpably different. The young Marines who had once dismissed Martin Kelly now regarded him with a deep respect. They didn't just see him as an old veteran anymore, but as a symbol of what it truly meant to serve. Martin, however, remained as humble as ever. He didn't seek accolades or recognition. He had already earned his place, not through ceremonies or words, but through the quiet strength he had carried with him through decades of service. Evans, the lance corporal who had once mocked Martin, found himself wrestling with his thoughts. He had always prided himself on his discipline and sharpness, but now, after hearing Martin speak and reflecting on his own actions, he felt a deep sense of shame. He had been so quick to judge the old man based on his appearance and age, without ever considering the life Martin had lived. As the days went on, Evans sought Martin out. It wasn't easy. The old man didn't go out of his way to make himself known, and Evans had learned that if he wanted to learn something from Martin, he would have to make the effort. Finally, Evans found Martin sitting in the corner of the mess hall, sipping his coffee in the quiet way he always did. The young Marine walked over, his footsteps hesitant but determined. "Sergeant." "Major," Evans said softly, his voice a mix of respect and uncertainty. "I wanted to apologize for my actions before. The way I treated you. I didn't understand, but I do now. You're not just a veteran. You're a legend, and I was wrong to judge you." Martin looked up at him, his face calm, the same quiet strength emanating from him. "You're a good man, Evans," he said, his voice steady. "It's not about being a legend. It's about being the kind of man who stands tall even when no one's watching. It's about the choices you make in the quiet moments, when no one else is around to see." Evans stood there, taking in Martin's words. The weight of them sank in deeply. "I'm trying to be that man," Evans said, his voice quiet. "I just don't always know how." Martin nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "None of us do, son," he replied. "But that's the journey. Every day is a new chance to choose who you want to be. And you have to take it, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." Evans nodded, his heart lighter than it had been in days. He didn't have all the answers, but he felt like he was finally on the right path. Over the next few weeks, Evans found himself spending more time with Martin. He didn't ask for grand stories or heroic feats. He simply asked questions about the life Martin had lived, about the lessons he had learned. And with each conversation, Evans grew. He began to understand the true meaning of service, not as something done for recognition or glory, but as something done out of duty, out of commitment to something larger than oneself. One day, as Evans walked with Martin outside the barracks, he noticed the old man's eyes looking toward the horizon, his gaze far away, as if he was seeing something only he could see. "What's on your mind, Sergeant Major?" Evans asked. Martin took a deep breath before answering. "I think about the men I served with," he said quietly. "The ones who never made it home. I carry them with me, every day. It's my duty to honor them, to keep their memory alive." Evans listened intently, understanding the weight of Martin's words. He had never really thought about the sacrifices others had made, about the brothers in arms who had given everything. But now he could feel that weight too. "I never got to meet them," Evans said after a long pause. "But I get it now. I understand why you carry them with you." Martin looked at him then, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "You will meet them one day, Evans," he said, his voice low but full of meaning. "And when that day comes, you'll know what it means to truly honor their memory." The young Marine stood there, the significance of the moment settling into his bones. He didn't know when or how it would happen, but he knew that someday, he would face the same reckoning that Martin had faced so many years ago. And when that day came, he would be ready, with the lessons Martin had shared guiding him through it. As the sun set over the base, Evans felt a sense of peace he had never known before. He had learned what it truly meant to serve, to honor the past, and to carry the weight of duty with grace. And in that moment, he knew that he was becoming the man Martin had spoken of, the kind of man who stood tall, even when no one else was around to see. Weeks passed, and the once somber atmosphere of the base slowly began to shift. The young Marines, particularly Evans, who had been directly impacted by Martin Kelly's teachings, carried themselves differently. The cocky attitude that had once been a staple of their demeanor had been replaced with a quiet respect, a realization that there was much more to serving than the flashy uniforms and the noise of battle. Evans, now more reflective than ever, found himself seeking out the lessons that Martin had shared. He no longer saw service as just a job or a means to an end. It was a lifelong commitment to something greater than himself, to a code that went beyond medals or recognition. One afternoon, as Evans walked along the base, he noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench near the training fields. It was Martin Kelly, his wheelchair parked under the shade of a tree, his eyes focused on the horizon. Evans made his way over, the ground crunching under his boots. "Sergeant Major," he greeted, his voice respectful but filled with curiosity. Martin turned to him with a slight smile, his eyes always steady, as if seeing through the years and beyond the surface. "Lance Corporal Evans," Martin replied, his voice low but warm. "What brings you here?" Evans took a seat beside him, looking out at the training fields, where young Marines were practicing maneuvers and formations. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Evans began. "About duty, about honor, about how it's not just the work we do, but the kind of man we are that matters." Martin nodded, his gaze unwavering as he observed the soldiers at work. "It's good to reflect," he said simply. "But don't get caught up in thinking you have it all figured out. The real work is in the small moments. It's in the choices you make when no one is watching." Evans glanced at Martin, his eyes searching for deeper meaning. "What does that really mean?" he asked. Martin turned to him, his face calm, but his voice intense. "It means that when you walk away from this uniform, when the job is done, you have to be the same man you were when it started. You don't get to hide behind the uniform, behind the rank. Who you are without all of that is what matters." Evans sat in silence, the weight of Martin's words sinking in. He had always measured himself by his uniform, by the recognition he received, but now, for the first time, he saw the emptiness of that. "I think I'm starting to understand," Evans said slowly. "But I also know that the more I learn, the more I realize how much I still have to grow." Martin chuckled softly, the sound filled with the quiet wisdom of experience. "That's the way it should be, Evans," he said. "The day you stop learning, the day you think you've figured it all out, is the day you stop growing. And if you stop growing, you stop being the man you could be." Evans felt a deep sense of gratitude toward Martin. The old man had lived through so much, seen so much, and yet he was still so humble, so willing to share his wisdom with others. Martin's life wasn't about boasting about his achievements or seeking praise. It was about quietly doing his duty, day in and day out, no matter the circumstances. And that, Evans realized, was the true meaning of honor. "I've been thinking about the guys we lost too," Evans said, his voice quieter now. "The ones who never made it home. I never really thought about what they left behind, what they gave up." Martin's expression softened, his eyes distant for a moment. "They gave everything," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And it's our duty to make sure they're never forgotten. Not in the stories we tell, but in the way we live our lives." Evans nodded, feeling the weight of Martin's words. He thought about his friends, the men he had trained with, the ones who had been left behind in far-off lands. And for the first time, he understood that honoring them wasn't about waving a flag or giving a speech. It was about living a life that was worthy of their sacrifice. The two sat in silence for a while, watching the Marines train. The sounds of the drills and commands faded into the background as Evans thought about everything he had learned from Martin. He thought about his own life, the choices he had made, and the choices he would continue to make. The man sitting next to him wasn't just a hero in the traditional sense. Martin Kelly had lived a life of quiet service, not for fame or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. And that, Evans realized, was the kind of man he wanted to be. "Thank you, Sergeant Major," Evans said finally, his voice full of gratitude. Martin looked at him, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're welcome, son," he replied. "But remember, it's not about me. It's about what you do next, and the man you choose to become." As the sun began to set over the training fields, Evans sat next to Martin, feeling a sense of peace that had eluded him for so long. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. The lessons Martin had shared with him would stay with him for the rest of his life. And that was more valuable than any medal or accolade. The true measure of a man, he now understood, was in how he lived his life, not in the recognition he received. And from this moment on, Evans was determined to live with that understanding, to honor the legacy of those who had come before him by being the best man he could be. As the days continued to pass on base, Evans found himself slowly changing, not just in how he viewed the men and women around him, but in how he viewed himself. The words Martin had shared with him echoed in his mind constantly. It's not about the rank you hold, the medals you wear, or the accolades you receive. It's about what you do when no one is looking. Those words had become a guiding principle in Evans' life. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a deeper understanding of what it meant to be a soldier, a man of integrity. It wasn't easy. There were days when the old habits crept back in, days when the pressure to prove himself in front of his peers threatened to pull him back into old patterns. But Evans fought against that, using the lessons Martin had taught him to stay grounded. He began seeking out more quiet moments, moments of reflection, moments where he could truly think about the kind of person he wanted to be. And it wasn't just Evans who had changed. The ripple effect of Martin Kelly's presence had begun to spread across the entire base. The young Marines who had once dismissed him as an old man in a wheelchair now spoke of him with respect, admiration, and a sense of reverence. They too had begun to understand that true service wasn't about seeking recognition. It was about living a life of purpose, humility, and dedication to something larger than oneself. One morning, a few weeks after Martin's speech at the ceremony, Evans was assigned to a small training group. The group consisted of a handful of younger Marines who had not been there during the incident in the mess hall. They were still fresh-faced, eager to prove themselves. As Evans began the training session, he noticed that they were more focused, more attentive than he had ever seen younger Marines before. It wasn't just that they were following orders, they were listening, really listening. There was a new level of respect in the room, a respect that had been earned, not demanded. As the training session wrapped up, Evans found himself reflecting on how much had changed. It wasn't just him who had grown, the entire environment on base felt different. The younger Marines, who had once been full of bravado, now carried themselves with a quiet confidence, their eyes open to the lessons of those who had come before them. Later that afternoon, as Evans sat alone in the mess hall, sipping his coffee, he saw Martin again, sitting at his usual spot near the window. There was something peaceful about Martin, something that Evans couldn't quite put into words. It was the kind of peace that only comes from a life well lived, from a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with fame or accolades. Evans stood up and made his way over to the table. Martin looked up as he approached, his expression as calm and steady as ever. "Sergeant Major," Evans said, standing in front of him. "I wanted to thank you again. For everything. I know I've changed, but it's all because of you." Martin looked at him, his eyes soft with understanding. "You did the work, Evans. All I did was point you in the right direction." Evans shook his head. "No, you taught me more than I could have ever learned on my own. You taught me that it's not about the uniform or the medals. It's about being the kind of man you can be proud of, no matter what anyone else thinks." Martin smiled faintly, his eyes glimmering with quiet pride. "That's what matters," he said simply. "It's not about being proud of what others see. It's about being proud of who you are when no one is looking." Evans nodded, taking in the weight of those words. It wasn't just a lesson in being a better Marine. It was a lesson in being a better person. And that, Evans realized, was the most important thing of all. The days that followed were filled with small moments of growth. Evans didn't expect to change overnight, but he began to feel more confident in his decisions, more certain of the man he was becoming. He began to mentor the younger Marines, guiding them with the same humility and wisdom that Martin had shown him. It wasn't about imposing his views on them. It was about showing them a better way to live, a way rooted in respect, service, and integrity. One day, during a rare moment of downtime, Evans sat with a small group of Marines outside the barracks, talking quietly. They were discussing everything from their future careers to the lessons they had learned on base. Evans shared some of the insights Martin had given him, the wisdom that had changed his perspective. As he spoke, he noticed that the young Marines were hanging on his every word, not because of his rank, but because of the sincerity in his voice, the authenticity he now carried. As the conversation wound down, one of the Marines looked at him and said, "You know, Evans, you've changed. You're not the same guy who showed up here a few months ago. You seem different. Like you actually care about us, about what we're doing here." Evans smiled, the words resonating deep within him. "I do care," he said, "more than I ever did before. Because I've learned that this isn't just about us. It's about the people we serve, the lives we touch, and the legacy we leave behind. And if we're not living that way, then what are we really doing here?" The young Marine nodded thoughtfully, his expression thoughtful as he looked around at the others. There was a shift in the group, an unspoken understanding that had passed between them all. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were becoming something more, a brotherhood grounded in respect, purpose, and humility. As Evans stood up to head back to his duties, he felt a deep sense of pride, not in what he had accomplished, but in the man he was becoming. The lessons from Martin Kelly had reshaped his life, and now he was passing them on, ensuring that the legacy of true service would live on in the next generation. As he walked away, he couldn't help but think that this was only the beginning. There was still so much more to learn, so much more to give, and he was ready for whatever came next. The sun had begun to set over the base, casting long shadows across the training fields. Evans walked slowly across the yard, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. It had been a few months since that day in the mess hall when everything had changed. The young Marines he now trained with had come a long way since then. They were quieter, more focused, and most importantly, they were beginning to understand what it meant to serve with true honor. Evans still carried the lessons Martin Kelly had taught him, but now, he was passing them on to others. As Evans made his way back to the barracks, he spotted a familiar figure sitting alone on a bench by the fence. It was Martin, as usual, calm and composed, his wheelchair positioned to face the horizon. Evans smiled to himself, the sense of respect he had for the old man growing every day. Martin had been more than just a mentor to him. He had been the embodiment of the values Evans had once taken for granted: duty, integrity, and humility. Evans walked over to the bench, taking a seat next to Martin without a word. For a moment, the two of them sat in silence, watching the last of the sunlight fade from the sky. Finally, Martin spoke. "It's a good day," he said, his voice steady. Evans nodded. "Yeah, it is. It feels like things are finally starting to come together." Martin turned to him, his expression as calm as always. "They always do, eventually. But it's not about how long it takes. It's about the work you put in, day by day. You've learned that, haven't you?" Evans took a deep breath, the weight of the question sinking in. "I think I'm starting to get it," he said, his voice quiet. "It's not just about being good at the job. It's about being the kind of person who can be proud of themselves when it's all over. And that's harder than I thought." Martin smiled, a faint glimmer of pride in his eyes. "That's the hardest part, son. But it's also the most rewarding. You're getting there, one step at a time. I can see it." Evans looked at him, a feeling of gratitude swelling in his chest. "I wouldn't have gotten here without you," he said. "You've taught me more than any of my instructors ever did." Martin chuckled softly. "I just pointed you in the right direction. You did the rest." Evans nodded. "I'm trying to. Every day." There was a moment of quiet between them, the sound of distant voices and the hum of activity on the base filling the air. Evans felt a shift inside himself. He was no longer just a Marine in uniform. He was becoming the kind of man Martin had always been: steady, reliable, and humble. He had learned to stop seeking recognition and to focus on the work that mattered. As they sat together, the evening grew darker and the base quieted down. Evans realized that he didn't need to look for validation from others anymore. He didn't need to prove himself. The only thing that mattered was the man he was becoming. That was the legacy Martin Kelly had passed on to him. "Sergeant Major," Evans said after a long pause, "do you ever think about the future?" Martin turned his head slightly, considering the question. "The future?" he repeated. "Not much. I've learned that the future has a way of coming to you, whether you're ready or not. All you can do is keep walking forward, doing your best each day. What happens next is out of your hands." Evans thought about that. It was true. He had spent so much of his life focusing on what came next, on the next promotion, the next mission. But he had never truly considered the simple value of living each day with purpose. "I guess that's all any of us can do," Evans said finally. "Just take it one day at a time." Martin nodded. "Exactly. The day you stop living that way is the day you start losing your way. Evans sat in silence for a few moments, absorbing the weight of Martin's words. He had learned that true leadership didn't come from power or rank. It came from living with integrity and doing the right thing, even when no one was looking. Martin had shown him that, and now he was determined to carry that lesson with him. "You know," Evans said with a small smile, "there's a part of me that wishes I could have learned all of this sooner." Martin's expression softened, but he didn't say anything for a long moment. "It doesn't matter when you learn it, as long as you do. What's important is what you do with it from here on out." Evans nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over him. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, moments when he would doubt himself, moments when he would want to give up. But now, he had the tools to face those moments. He had the lessons Martin had taught him. As the last light of the day disappeared behind the horizon, Evans stood up, ready to return to his duties. Martin remained seated, his eyes still focused on the distance. "I'll see you tomorrow, Sergeant Major," Evans said, his voice full of gratitude. "I'll be here," Martin replied softly, his voice steady as ever. "And I'll be proud of you, no matter what." Evans turned and walked away, feeling a sense of calm he had never known before. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right path. The path of true service, of living with honor, and of making every day count. As the months passed, the base seemed to have undergone a subtle transformation. It wasn't just the younger Marines who had changed. There was a shift in the air, a collective understanding that had taken root. Evans, who had once struggled with his own arrogance, now stood taller, more centered. He wasn't seeking validation anymore. He didn't need the loud praise or the recognition that had once been his driving force. Now, he found fulfillment in the quiet moments, in the act of serving with integrity, and in helping the next generation of Marines understand what it truly meant to live honorably. He had become a mentor, not by imposing his own views, but by embodying the values Martin Kelly had taught him. One afternoon, during a routine training exercise, Evans found himself leading a small team of Marines through a set of drills. They were a mixture of fresh recruits and more experienced soldiers, and as Evans moved from one group to the next, offering advice and guidance, he could see the subtle change in their demeanor. They were more focused, more present. They weren't just following orders anymore. They were thinking for themselves, using the lessons they had learned from their training, from each other, and, in some cases, from the veterans who had come before them. Later that evening, Evans sat down in the mess hall with his team. They had just finished a long day of drills, and the room was filled with the usual banter of young Marines winding down. But there was something different about this group. There was no bragging, no trying to one-up each other. They were talking about the work, about the challenges they had faced, and how they had overcome them. As Evans listened, he couldn't help but smile. He had seen these Marines grow. They had begun to understand the true nature of service, just as he had, through the lessons Martin had shared with him. The door to the mess hall swung open, and Evans looked up to see an unexpected figure enter. It was Martin Kelly, rolling his wheelchair slowly into the room, his usual calm demeanor radiating from him. Evans stood up, instinctively, his respect for the old man still as strong as ever. Martin gave him a nod, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Sergeant Major," Evans greeted him, his voice filled with warmth. "What brings you here today?" Martin's eyes twinkled slightly as he looked around the room. "I was in the neighborhood," he replied with a small chuckle, "and I thought I'd check in on you all." Evans gestured to the group at the table. "You're always welcome, Sergeant Major. We've been talking about the drills, about the work we've been doing." Martin nodded thoughtfully. "I've seen the change in you, Evans. You've come a long way." The words hit Evans deeper than he had anticipated. It was one thing to hear the lessons, but it was another thing entirely to realize they had taken root. "It's all thanks to you, Sergeant Major," Evans said quietly, a sense of gratitude welling up inside him. "You taught me what it really means to serve. Not for recognition, not for the glory, but because it's the right thing to do." Martin smiled softly, the weight of his years apparent in his expression. "You've got it, son," he said, his voice steady but filled with pride. "You've learned what many never do, and that's something worth remembering." As the conversation shifted to other topics, Evans found himself reflecting on the path he had taken to get here. He had come to the base full of youthful arrogance, thinking that the strength of his uniform would be enough to earn respect. But it wasn't. It had never been about the uniform, the rank, or the medals. It had always been about the man behind the uniform, the choices he made when no one was watching. He looked around the table at the younger Marines, who were now deep in conversation about the day's training. They were laughing and learning from each other, without the need for competition or bravado. They were starting to understand what it meant to be a Marine, not just in the drills, but in life. They're getting it, Evans thought to himself, a quiet sense of pride swelling in his chest. They're learning what I had to learn, and they're learning it faster than I did. The evening wore on, and Martin eventually left, as quietly as he had entered. As he rolled out of the mess hall, Evans felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had learned so much from the old man. He had learned that service was not about what you wore or the honors you received, but about the life you led and the people you helped along the way. He had learned that being a Marine wasn't about being the strongest, the fastest, or the most decorated. It was about being a man of integrity, someone who could be counted on, someone who could stand tall even in the face of adversity. And as Evans sat back down at the table with his team, he realized that the lessons he had learned from Martin Kelly would stay with him for the rest of his life. He wasn't just a Marine anymore. He was a man of honor, of purpose, and he would carry that legacy forward, just as Martin had done before him. The next few weeks felt like a quiet turning point for Evans. The lessons he had learned from Martin Kelly were now embedded in his every action, shaping how he interacted with his fellow Marines and how he approached each new day. He had stopped looking for validation in the usual places. No longer was he concerned with promotions or awards. His sense of purpose had shifted. It was no longer about recognition, but about the integrity of the work, the kind of man he was becoming, and the example he set for others. The transformation wasn't just in Evans. The entire base seemed to be evolving. The arrogance that had once been so prevalent in the younger Marines had softened. There was a new respect in the air, one that was born not out of fear, but out of true admiration for the values that had been instilled in them by veterans like Martin. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling training session, Evans found himself sitting on the steps of the barracks, catching his breath. He looked around at the Marines who were sprawled out on the lawn, exhausted but content. They were talking in quieter tones, reflecting on what they had learned, sharing their thoughts without the bravado that used to fill the air. As Evans sat there, he realized just how far they had come. The drills, the tests, the endless hours of practice were no longer just about improving their skills. They were about understanding the true nature of what it meant to be a Marine. It wasn't just about physical strength or tactical ability. It was about mental and emotional fortitude, about standing up for what was right, no matter the cost. A voice pulled Evans from his thoughts. He turned to see one of the younger Marines, a private named Carter, walking toward him. Carter had been part of the group that had mocked Martin that day in the mess hall. Since then, he had been quieter, more reserved, and seemed to be thinking about things more deeply. "Hey, Evans," Carter said, standing in front of him. "Got a minute?" Evans nodded, a small smile on his face. "Sure, what's on your mind?" Carter hesitated for a moment, then sat down beside him. "I've been thinking about what you said in the mess hall the other day, about how it's not about the rank or the uniform, but about who you are when no one's looking." Evans raised an eyebrow, surprised that Carter had taken his words to heart. Yeah, Carter replied. "I've been trying to figure it out, trying to be the kind of guy you talked about, and I think I'm getting it. It's just hard sometimes, you know." Evans nodded. He understood more than Carter realized. It's always hard, especially at first, but it gets easier the more you focus on it. It's not about being perfect, it's about being consistent. And when you screw up, you own it. You don't make excuses. That's how you build character. Carter looked down at his boots, deep in thought. "I think I get it," he said slowly. "But I still feel like I'm not measuring up. Like I'm not the guy I want to be yet." Evans smiled softly, his eyes filled with understanding. "Nobody gets there overnight. We all have to keep working at it. But I'll tell you this, Carter, the fact that you're thinking about it, that you want to improve, that's the first step. And that's something not everyone gets. Keep doing that, and you'll be surprised at the man you become." Carter looked up, his face brightening a little. "Thanks, Evans. I think I can do that." Evans patted him on the back. "I know you can." As Carter stood up and walked back to the group, Evans watched him for a moment, then turned his gaze to the horizon. The evening was beginning to settle in, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the trees. He thought about the path he had walked to get here, the lessons he had learned, and the people who had guided him along the way. Most of all, he thought about Martin Kelly, the man who had shown him the true meaning of service. Martin had never asked for anything. He had never sought attention or praise. He had simply lived with quiet dignity, doing the right thing because it was the right thing to do. And now, Evans was beginning to understand that, even when it felt difficult, even when it felt like no one was watching, doing the right thing was always worth it. Evans stood up from the steps, brushing the dirt from his uniform. He had come a long way since that day in the mess hall, and though there was still much to learn, he felt ready for whatever came next. He was no longer the young Marine searching for validation. He was a man who understood what it meant to serve, to lead, and to live with honor. As he walked back toward the barracks, he knew that Martin's lessons had taken root in more than just himself. The next generation of Marines was being shaped by them too. And that, Evans realized, was the true legacy of service. Not the individual actions, but the way those actions inspired others to be better, to do better. That was the ripple effect that would continue, long after the drills were over, long after the uniforms were put away. It was the kind of legacy that would last a lifetime. As Evans walked through the base, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of change within himself and the Marines around him. It had been several months since Martin Kelly's words had shifted everything. For him, the change wasn't just in his own behavior. He could see it in the younger Marines now. They were no longer focused solely on climbing the ranks or accumulating medals. There was a new sense of purpose, a focus on the values that had been instilled in them through their training, their interactions with veterans, and, in many cases, the quiet wisdom of people like Martin. Evans had begun to notice subtle changes even in his own squad. The sharp, competitive edge that had once driven them had softened. Now, they spent more time helping each other, pushing each other to grow not just as soldiers, but as men of character. He had become not just a mentor in the technical aspects of their work, but also a guide in helping them understand the true nature of service. One afternoon, during an intense field exercise, Evans found himself with a group of new recruits. They were working through a simulation that required precision and calm, something the newer Marines often struggled with. As Evans led them through the steps, he couldn't help but notice the difference in how they approached the task. They were more patient, more thoughtful, and less reactive. It was as if they were learning to think through their actions rather than relying on instincts alone. After the exercise, Evans took a moment to speak with them. They gathered in a tight circle around him, their faces eager for feedback. "You all did well today," Evans said, his voice calm but firm. "I've seen a lot of growth from all of you. You didn't rush, you thought things through. And that's what it takes." He paused for a moment, scanning their faces. "But I want you to remember something. This isn't just about winning the exercise. It's about the mindset you carry with you every single day. It's about who you are when the mission is over and no one's watching. That's when your true character shows." One of the recruits, a young man with a bit of nervous energy, looked up at Evans. "I get what you mean, Sergeant," he said. "But how do we know when we're doing the right thing? How do we know when we're living the way we're supposed to?" Evans smiled, the question taking him back to the days when he had asked himself the same thing. "You'll know," he said simply. "You'll know because you won't need anyone else to tell you. You'll feel it inside. The right choices aren't always the easy ones, but they're the ones that keep you up straight, no matter what comes at you. You'll know." The young recruit nodded, seeming to take the words to heart. As Evans watched them walk away, he felt a sense of pride. It wasn't about the drills or the exercises. It was about what they took from those moments and carried with them. A few days later, Evans was walking back to his quarters when he saw Martin once again sitting in the same spot near the barracks. As usual, Martin was quietly observing the world around him, his eyes focused on something only he could see. Evans approached, feeling a quiet connection to the man who had changed everything for him. "Sergeant Major," Evans said, standing beside him. "I wanted to check in, see how you're doing." Martin turned his head slowly, offering Evans a smile. "I'm doing well, son," he replied. "How about you?" Evans sat down beside him, looking out at the base. "I think I'm getting there. It's still a journey, but I'm getting closer. The Marines, the recruits, they're learning. I can see it. I can see them changing, just like I did." Martin nodded thoughtfully. "That's how it works. You don't change overnight, but you plant the seeds and you water them every day. That's all you can do. Evans thought about that. It felt right. He had spent so much of his life wanting quick results, wanting to be good now, but he had learned that lasting change came from consistent effort. It wasn't about the immediate payoff, it was about the long-term growth. You're right, Evans said after a moment. It's about consistency. Martin smiled again, a look of pride in his eyes. You're learning. That's the most important thing. They sat in silence for a while, both of them taking in the stillness of the evening. The sounds of the bass had quieted, the hum of distant chatter and the clanking of boots slowly fading into the background. Evans realized that the peace they shared in that moment was the culmination of everything he had been striving for. It wasn't just about the missions or the medals anymore. It was about the quiet, everyday decisions that made a person who they were. He had learned, through Martin's example, that true honor was found in the small moments, the ones where no one else was looking, where a person's character could shine through. Thank you, Sergeant Major, Evans said quietly, looking over at Martin. For everything. I wouldn't have gotten here without you. Martin's gaze softened. You got yourself here, Evans. I just helped you see the path. Evans smiled, feeling the weight of those words. He had done the work. He had walked the path, step by step. And now, he was ready for whatever came next. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, he felt at peace with where he was headed. As the evening continued to unfold around them, Evans knew that the lessons he had learned from Martin would guide him, not just in his career, but in life. And with that knowledge, he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The days grew quieter as the base settled into a new rhythm. Evans had noticed a difference in the way the Marines interacted with one another, a deeper understanding of what it meant to be part of something greater than themselves. The lessons Martin Kelly had shared with him had become a guiding principle, not just for Evans, but for the entire base. There was less boasting, less rivalry, and more focus on teamwork, humility, and integrity. Evans continued to lead his squad with a newfound sense of purpose. It wasn't about being the best on the field or proving himself in front of others anymore. It was about doing the job right, being the kind of leader who cared about his Marines, and making sure that the values of service and duty were passed down to the next generation. One evening, Evans found himself in the mess hall again, sitting at a table by himself. It had been months since he had first changed the way he viewed his service, and he could feel the weight of that transformation in every action, every decision. His mind drifted back to the first conversation he'd had with Martin Kelly, the words that had shaken him to his core. It's not about the uniform or the medals, Martin had said. It's about the man behind them. Those words had become Evans' mantra. He had spent so much of his life looking for external validation, but now he understood that true validation came from within. He didn't need anyone's approval to know that he was doing the right thing. The door to the mess hall opened, and Evans looked up to see Martin rolling in, just as he always did. Despite his age, the old man still moved with the same calm determination, his eyes sharp and focused. Evans stood up, a smile on his face, and waved him over. Martin approached, his wheelchair rolling smoothly across the floor, and Evans gestured for him to sit. Sergeant Major, Evans greeted him warmly. Good to see you. Martin smiled and settled into the chair across from him. Good to see you too, son, he replied. The two sat in silence for a moment, each of them taking in the calm of the room. The mess hall had become quieter, more reflective, much like the men who now filled it. I've been thinking, Evans began, his voice low, about how much has changed. Not just with me, but with everyone. It's like we're finally getting it, the real meaning of service. Martin nodded, his expression thoughtful. That's what it's all about, Evans. Not the uniform, not the medals. It's about who you are when it's just you. And I think you're starting to see that. Evans smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. I am. But it's more than that. I think I've started to see the kind of leader I want to be. The kind of man I want to be. And it's all because of you. Martin's eyes softened, and for a moment, Evans could see the faintest flicker of emotion in them. You've always had it in you, Evans. I just gave you a little push in the right direction. Evans felt a lump form in his throat. He had been so focused on proving himself for so long. But now, with Martin's guidance, he had come to understand that the journey wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about being the man he was meant to be, living up to the promises he had made to himself, to the Marines around him, and to the men who had come before him. I won't let you down, Evans said quietly, looking at Martin. I won't forget the lessons you've taught me. Martin smiled again, his eyes glinting with pride. You've already proven you won't, son. And that's all any of us can do. Just keep living the right way, day by day. That's how we honor those who came before us. As the evening wore on, the two men continued to talk. The conversation shifted from one topic to another, but the underlying message remained the same: service, humility, integrity. The kind of values that didn't need to be broadcast or praised, but were felt in every action, in every decision. As Evans listened to Martin, he realized that the old man had already passed on everything he needed to know. It was up to him now to carry those lessons forward, to make sure that the next generation of Marines understood what it truly meant to serve. The evening came to a close, and Martin prepared to leave. As he stood to wheel himself out of the mess hall, Evans stood with him. Thank you, Sergeant Major, Evans said, his voice thick with gratitude. Martin smiled, giving him a nod. You don't need to thank me, Evans. You've got everything you need inside you. Just keep walking the path. Evans watched as Martin rolled out of the mess hall, his steady presence leaving behind a sense of calm. It was the quiet confidence of a man who had lived a life of service and had no need for recognition. Evans knew then that his journey wasn't over. It had just begun, but he was ready for whatever came next. He had the lessons, the guidance, and the strength to carry them forward. The legacy of Martin Kelly would live on through him, and through every Marine who understood what it truly meant to serve. As the doors closed behind him, Evans turned back to the table, his heart full, knowing that his path was now clear. He would walk it with honor, with integrity, and with the same quiet strength that had defined Martin Kelly's life.